Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Hirschhorn. Thank you guys so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, what the hell did we just watch?
Yeah, I feel a lot less useful after that. Good Lord.
That was easily the ugliest Cam Newton game that I have ever sat and watched, and with play calling decisions that rival that of the Childress era Vikings, maybe even the Leslie Frazier era Vikings, on top of refs that didn't seem to know, like, they knew the answer to the question, but not why they knew the answer to the question.
Right. It's like we got like multi-meal football, right?
Oh, basically, yeah. Like, I mean, it was kind of football. It was football shaped.
Yeah, it was shaped like football. It certainly didn't have any of the football contents that you've come to expect.
God,
the biggest issue is that they poured the multi-meal into an NFL-shaped box. That's the worst part.
Like, see, it's football. Like, no, it's not. This is Cam Newton with something clearly wrong, despite the fact that Troy McClure, but Troy Aikman, same amount of credibility here, continually telling us, no, look at that throw, he's fine. Look at that move, he's fine.
He's fine.
Troy Aikman is gaslighting the entire world as we're watching Cam Newton break down worse than the tennis player in the Royal Tenenbaums. Like, this was abysmal. Every third, maybe fourth pass was catchable. It was rough. This defense from Tampa Bay was not good. This was not a great defense, and they controlled what did. I can't figure out exactly what ended up happening here. It was almost like a sea witch had come and taken Cam Newton's ability to play quarterback or something. Lend me your voice. Like, I don't understand what the hell I just watched. Cam Newton needs to be mobile, right? Like, that was a thing, right? This team went to the Super Bowl 3 years ago, right?
Yeah, there's like not a great comparison, right? So like in the interview with Jason that we're going to do later in the show, I made a comparison between Aaron Rodgers and the Hater's Guide to Josh Allen, like the worst version of Josh Allen, which the comparison makes sense. Don't worry about it. But but you can't say that Cam Newton looked like Josh Allen because Josh Allen can run, right? And like this Cam Newton can't. Tim Tebow, you can't, I mean, they're about as accurate as each other, but Tebow ran the ball and was great in the clutch and, whatever you want to call that. And this was not that. This is like a team went down to their fourth quarterback, their emergency quarterback, and they're like, yeah, I played football, a quarterback in high school, so I could probably throw it. And they're like, yeah, you're running the whole playbook, dude. Oh, cool. Okay, cool.
So get ready on the banana scramble. What?
Right.
What's a hook route? I don't.
Well, yeah, I've played defense for the last 6 years. What's happening?
I'm just a play. I'm just the holder. Like what? Why do I have a ball in my hands for more than a second? I don't understand what's going on here. Good God. So you'll read the Twitter takes and you'll maybe catch a couple of YouTube clips of it, and likely Cam Newton is going to look like the WWE's Velveteen Dream when he goes into the press conference here. But that does not adequately describe what that was. Watching Cam Newton not run, not scramble. You're what was it, a yard and a half? Was it a half yard? And it was fourth down. You're in the red zone and you can't. I don't.
Yeah, it's stunning, right? Because you're like, because one of the complaints that we've had about North Turner over the decades, over his. That's what the game felt like it. Over his time with Minnesota,
in the
was
before
like,
time, in the
right.
long ago.
Like, oh God, the quarterback's always lining up under center, right? You can't 7-step dropbacks, and he's not creative. He's just not creative. And then the key play of the game, he gets too creative, right? So I'm told that this is quote unquote Carolina special, right? It's the Philly special where the quarterback is adjusting things at the line, and then the ball is snapped, and oh my God, and then he might throw the ball, right? So I was told that, and I had to be told that because I just thought it was Wildcat. Like, I just saw McCaffrey alone in the backfield, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, so it's Wildcat. I wouldn't do that, but okay. And apparently the whole point was to trick the defense into thinking Cam was adjusting the line, and he's just like standing there chatting with the tight end, like, hey, what's going on? Cool.
I haven't seen apathy like that since Jay Cutler retired. Since Jay Cutler lined up as a receiver, looking like he was just waiting to like bum a smoke from the next person who was leaving the bar.
Right. Yeah, it was nuts.
And like you had said, it was an attempt at like a Philly special sort of thing. The only people who thought that Cam Newton might be doing that was like Norv Turner.
Right.
Because anybody who had watched the game knew that Cam Newton wasn't going to move anywhere. He wasn't going to move 6 inches in front of him. He wasn't going to move back. He was just going to stand there.
Yeah, so the thing that gets me is like, okay, so like, let's say, because of his health or whatever, you're attempting to, not have him run the ball, kind of preserve him. If he's running the ball, it's an open space, like that triple option on 4th down a while back. Okay, I kind of understand that. But like, you can't have him in the game if the level of concern about his health, and this is hypothetical, I haven't seen anyone say that, the health concerns are the reason, but that's the only one I can speculate on. But you can't have him in a football game if on the key play of the game to win the game, you can't have him QB sneak. A play, by the way, that quarterbacks are hurt very rarely on, kind of despite the fact that they, are supposed to get.
Kirk Cousins did it,
eaten.
Twice, 3 times on Sunday?
Yeah. Right.
Kirk Cousins did nothing on Sunday. And his pizza ranch loving ass was able to do it. Like, I don't. What the hell was that? And, all right. So, full disclosure, I may have drafted Cam Newton in one of my leagues, and this is just frustration coming from that. But
I may
still,
have drafted Cam Newton in several of my leagues. Oopsies.
This may have been short-sighted on our part. What the? Oh, all right. So, welcome to your show about the Minnesota Vikings. Arif before the show had made a comment about how he's glad that we do 2 shows a week because he wouldn't be able to focus on whatever the hell on what the Vikings did after watching whatever the hell that game was.
Yeah, they bleached my eyes.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have been able to remember what football was.
Twice in 2 weeks they did this on Thursday night. So congrats. So we have a Packers game to preview, a little border battle that game will be happening at Sunday at noon. So we have a special guest that we will be bringing on in just a moment, Jason Hirschhorn. I believe is how that's pronounced. He will be coming on to discuss all things Packers. But before we do, just want to thank you guys so much for listening to the show, for tweeting at us, for following, for sharing links on social media, maybe even for donating to the show at patreon.com/norsecode or at paypal.me/norsecode. Again, really do appreciate it. If you'd like to donate in, as a one-time donation, you can do it through PayPal. If you'd like to do it as a continual donation, much like an NPR pledge drive or something like that, every little bit helps. It keeps us ad-free, helps allow the show to be twice a week, that sort of stuff. So again, thank you guys so much for listening. And I've been seeing a lot of kind words about the show on Reddit, on the Minnesota Vikings subreddit. Just want to thank you guys so much for propagating the formula, as Dusty would say. Let's go with that.
For swimming approvingly.
Yeah, exactly. For swimming approvingly with the Norse cod and helping spread the word. So again, thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate it. I love seeing the comments about how much you like the show or how you're trying to turn other people onto the show. So again, thank you guys so much. And now what we're going to do is we are going to go to an interview taped earlier with Arif and Jason Hirschhorn.
All right, Jason, thanks for coming on to the show. Pretty unique week, I think, for both Vikings fans and Packers fans, not because obviously the Vikings and the Packers are playing each other early in the season. That's happened a lot. But because I think they're both coming off of week ones where I don't know that we learned a ton about a team that both of them have new offenses. So what are your takeaways from the Packers offense? Just, big picture stuff about kind of what the new look offense should be.
I don't really know that there are that many takeaways that we can really have from week one. And there was so much about the offense that did look like what we expected from Matt LaFleur, and there was so much that didn't. Matt LaFleur and that offensive tree that includes Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay, and going back further, Gary Kubiak and Mike Shanahan, it's built off of play action and those outside zone runs. And the Packers certainly tried those outside zone runs, but we didn't really see a lot of play action. I believe they only attempted play action on, it was around 18% of their plays. Even for Green Bay, that seems like a really small amount. So I would anticipate that changes. But, until we see it, it's really hard to say because, we only have one season of Matt LaFleur calling an offense. And I guess now this week one game. So there's a lot to be learned in this upcoming game against the Vikings and then in the upcoming games, most of which are at Lambeau Field.
Yeah. So with all that said, the Packers only scored 10 points. Obviously, they're up against this remarkable defense. Are there concerns that maybe, the offense doesn't have everything together or the tools aren't there to score on a consistent basis? Or are we just chalking this up to, hey, it's the Bears?
You don't want to not credit the Bears defense for some of the Packers offensive inadequacies, but all of those things you named are at least questions right now. The Packers, as we just discussed, they didn't use very much play action. That's a central concept to the offense. They did not pass protect well, and perhaps that's because they didn't use enough play action. But we also saw some pretty poor play from Lane Taylor and Billy Turner, the Packers' two starting guards. That is a problem, especially when you're going up against a team like the Minnesota Vikings, which has a very strong defensive front. So I think there's a lot of pretty major concerns for the offense going into week two, and frankly, just for the foreseeable future until we see it rectified.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about that offensive line because I think, we're pretty used to the idea that the Packers, at least a couple of years ago, had one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, and they've had this stable of guards. They've had they've always had one or two pretty good tackles. So it feels like we're in the past couple of years we're in kind of this other area where the Packers have to deal with this poor offensive line. You mentioned Lane Taylor, Billy Turner. They struggled. I noticed that the Bakhtiari didn't end up with like this remarkable PFF grade either. Is that is he still a top 3 tackle? What's the concern level with the unit as a whole and David Bakhtiari in particular?
I don't think there's any long-term concerns with Bakhtiari. He was called for holding twice. That I guess suppose will happen, not usually to him, but I don't have any concerns with him. He's still fairly young. His skill set fits the offense. I don't expect that really to be a problem. Those guards, however, are a different story. Lane Taylor, I always thought was a very strange scheme fit for what Matt LaFleur wants to do, especially that outside zone. He's he is the slowest and frankly, just least fleet of foot offensive lineman the Packers have started in some time. And though he can still play capably when they're running inside zone, because they do some of those inside zone splits, I just don't know that he makes sense as a starter long-term in this scheme. Now, Billy Turner, from an athleticism standpoint, does, but that only works if he's able to actually block well. In the run, he was able to in week one, even though the team as a whole didn't really run block that well. But, I mean, he had several really bad blown pass protections, and that is a concern. I mean, that was a problem for him in Denver and in previous stops, like with the Miami Dolphins. The Packers invest a lot of money in him, and perhaps it's the first game. That unit didn't get a lot of time together in the preseason, and maybe by this time next month that looks very different. But until we see them perform well together, you have to question it.
All right. Well, so with all that in mind, do you think that you've seen all the debates about how much of the running game is driven by the offensive line and how much is driven by the running back? We're all pretty confident that Aaron Jones is a talented running back. Obviously, the running game, like you said, didn't get off the ground. Are you worried that the running game is just not going to be an effective feature of the offense going forward?
No, I think they'll be able to figure it out. It's just a question of how much they use it. Obviously, that was a big concern in 2018 when the Packers had one of the most efficient running attacks and basically just refused to use it. I don't think that's going to be a problem under Matt LaFleur. He seems very dedicated to the idea that, not that it has to be anything close to a 50-50 split, but that getting those runs in, especially getting them in on the earlier downs where the Packers were just so predictable in previous years where they were passing, I think, upwards of like 65, 70%. Like just being a little less predictable and getting a few more of those runs in so they can build those play action passes off of. I think that's something that they really want to do. And they're not going to play the Chicago Bears every week.
Right. That is so. This is kind of the same thing that happened when we're talking about the Vikings offensive line. Garrett Bradbury might have had a poor game. He goes up against Grady Jarrett, great defensive tackle. But you take a look at the Packers schedule, obviously very similar to the Vikings schedule. You've got all these great defensive lines coming up. You got the Vikings twice. You've got obviously the Bears again. You've got the Lions, who are now a pretty good team defensively, and then you've got the essentially the same host of teams the Vikings have going forward. Is there some point where you just say, hey, okay, they've got a good defensive line, but that's just who you have to be good against?
Yeah, that is a part of it too, right? Like the Packers offensive line, if they are going to go as far as they think they can, they're going to see a lot of good defensive lines. There are not a lot of bad defenses in the playoffs. So yeah, it's definitely something that has to improve. And again, it was one game against arguably the best defense in the NFL. You don't want to make too much of it because even this matchup, when it comes up later in the season, might look very different, even if it has all the same players. Again, this Packers offense as a whole did not get a lot of time together in the preseason, and Aaron Rodgers got literally no time in the preseason. All of these things need some time to work out, and we know that the first month of the season is essentially extended preseason. So I would caution, and not even just with the Packers, but a lot of teams around the NFL.
Yes.
Yeah, taking too much away from the first few weeks of the season. But, I mean, some of these things were concerns going into the season. I wasn't sure about Lane Taylor. I wasn't 100% sure about Billy Turner either. So we need to see them perform better before we can assume that unit is going to be okay moving forward.
7 offensive penalties, 5 of which were accepted by the defense. That a concern?
It has to be, right? Like that offense had so many issues, not even just with the penalties as a whole, but like just getting into their play sets fast enough. One of the hallmarks of this offensive scheme is getting to the line of scrimmage quickly so that you can have that pre-snap motion and you can sort of reveal what the defense is doing. Well, the Packers, as I'm sure you're familiar with having seen this team for quite a few years, didn't get to the line of scrimmage fast very often in week one. Now, that's one thing in a McCarthy offense that features not a lot of pre-snap motion. It's a whole nother thing when that is a huge part of the scheme. So again, maybe that's just a symptom of having little time together in the preseason. Maybe that's a larger problem that we're going to see revealed over the course of the next month. I don't know yet, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So let's talk a little bit about the weapons that Rodgers has to throw to. Obviously, you've got Davante Adams, a touchdown machine, one of the better receivers in the league. And obviously, there's been a lot of debates about, is Davante Adams better than Diggs or Thielen or both? But my real question is about everybody else. Like, so I know Marquez Valdes-Scantling, apparently, he's got issues maybe running the correct route or having the right offense or the right play. Geronimo Allison, he got 30 snaps, but he just always strikes me as kind of a non-factor. Jimmy Graham is, past his prime, pretty good for a touchdown, maybe. Big Bob Tonyan, apparently good for a deep play every so often. But it just feels like there's one weapon on the offense. Is that accurate? Am I right about that?
I'm not sure that that's accurate, but I'm also not sure that it isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, we know what Davante Adams is, at least to a certain degree in this offense. What we've seen out of Marquez Valdes-Scantling, excuse me, has been very promising, but we saw him as a rookie, granted in a different offensive scheme, but he really hit a wall. He made a lot of mistakes in terms of running the correct play, or in some cases just, beating press coverage. That was a big issue for him, especially late in the year. Now, he looks better this year, and the Packers coaching staff has definitely favored him early in training camp when they were going with either 21 or 12 personnel. You were seeing a lot of Adams and Geronimo Allison. That eventually flipped, where Valdes-Scantling became the other receiver in those looks, and he is the other starting boundary receiver when they go in 11 personnel. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that he has earned their trust. And what we saw, Rodgers had the one big play, and it was to Valdez-Scantling. That's what he can bring to the offense. He's a very capable deep threat, not just because of his speed, because of his ball tracking ability, and because of how big he is. I mean, I think we forget that he's, a 6'4" and change receiver. But, that even if he ends up being a capable starter, that's not the same as being someone that can really pull coverage away from Adams. I mean, the Bears at some points in week one were literally triple teaming him. That's not something that is sustainable for the Packers offense if nobody else can step up. Valdez-Scantling would be, I suppose, the most likely candidate, but we need to see that. Jimmy Graham, as you mentioned, here's a couple of things that he still does well, especially in the red zone, but that is not an every down tight end in this offense. He barely blocks, and when he does, it's almost like watching a rookie, funnily enough. And that's where some of the other tight ends are going to have to step up. Mercedes Lewis definitely can block. I mean, he has brought that throughout his career, but he can only do so much in the passing game. He's a guy who is almost I think he's the oldest player on the Packers roster, or pretty close to it. And, he can, make a couple catches here and there. I think he came very close to matching his 2018 total in week one alone. But I don't know that that's someone that you can really build that part of your offense around. So that's when it comes down to Robert Big Bob Tonyan. The Packers are very excited about him. They used him a lot down the stretch last year, and we saw a lot of good things from him in the preseason and training camp. But that's not the same as showing it during the regular season. And he was pretty quiet in week one. Again, against a very good defense, small sample size, all the caveats that we've been throwing out. But I think for this offense to really reach its peak, at least its peak as it can be with this particular set of personnel, he has to be a major factor. And we don't know yet whether or not he can.
All right. Well, right before we get to a discussion about, whether or not Aaron Rodgers has been washed for 3 years, which is always kind of a fun discussion, I do want to talk about the matchup specifically between Davante Adams and Xavier Rhodes, and I expect Rhodes will shadow him as he's done in the past. When Rhodes has been shadowing him, Davante Adams averages 1.51, or last year in 2018, 1.51 yards per out run. That's the same as Mohamed Sanu did all of last year, Marvin Jones did all of last year, Jarvis Landry did all of last year. So acting like a pretty good wide receiver 2, not quite like a wide receiver 1. When it's not Rhodes, when it's anybody else on any other team or even on the Vikings, 2.15 yards per out run, which is a top 10 number. I know that Davante Adams, it seems like he's had some pretty big games. He's always good for apparently a touchdown against the Vikings, but he doesn't get a ton of yards against the Vikings. Is this a matchup that, you're concerned about? You already talked about, how Chicago was comfortable double or even triple teaming him. Do you think that the Adams' skill alone will be enough to create space and generate maybe a 100-yard game?
Well, for starters, Xavier Rhodes is going to have that impact on virtually any receiver, even a top tier one like Davante Adams. Other than injuries, there really aren't that many big weaknesses in his game, and that's a big part of this discussion. What the Packers at least have said that they want to do more this year is move Adams into the slot, and in some cases motion him into the slot, which might change those matchups, especially if the Vikings are running zone, and then get him off of Rhodes. Now, that makes a lot of sense. It's something that I think that they should do, but we didn't see them do a lot of that in week one. And again, small sample size, all of that again, but maybe that is just talk. Maybe Adams is going to be a guy that's basically stationed on the perimeter, not moving a ton pre-snap. And that's just something that the Packers offense is going to be like for the foreseeable future. We don't know yet, but if they are able to get him off of Rhodes, whether it's by putting him in the slot or motioning him into the slot or any number of things that they can do, Adams could be in line for a big game. I mean, we've seen his stat line, even against the Vikings, even against Xavier Rhodes. He still is a factor, even if he's not the usual factor that he is. I think that that's something they're going to have to do because this isn't the Packers offense of the past. It's not even just that the scheme is different. These are not the weapons, and this is not the offensive line, as we've discussed, that they had 4 or 5 years ago when they could essentially line up the number one receiver against the number one corner and someone else would just get open. I think they're going to have to be a little more proactive about it. And again, they just did not show much of that in week one.
All right, so there's been a lot of evidence that Aaron Rodgers is an incredible quarterback, but a lot of that evidence has been built up between these remarkable seasons, pretty good 2009, pretty good 2010, phenomenal 2011. Between 2011 and 2015, had 8.4 or 8.35 adjusted net yards per attempt, good for first or second in that span among all quarterbacks. 2017 to 2019, 6.63 adjusted net yards per attempt. So going from second in the NFL or first in the NFL, all the way down to 15th or 16th. That's the same, actually, interestingly, as Mitchell Trubisky and Kirk Cousins. Those are the closest comparators across the league. Obviously, rough night. Obviously, Chicago Bears. PFF said he was one of the less accurate quarterbacks in week one. Again, Bears. But what evidence in the past 3 years can we point to say that Aaron Rodgers is good? Not that he has amazing flashes. He does. He's got remarkable arm strength, incredible in these comeback scenarios. But what evidence that he's just generalized as a good quarterback?
We honestly don't have a lot of evidence other than just those big peaks that he is that same player. He might be. There are plenty of circumstantial pieces that we can point to that suggest that some of the struggles aren't his fault, or whether they be because of the offense he was in or because of the injuries he's had. But that doesn't prove that he isn't that, or that he is that player. Right. That those have just been disguising that fact. And if we looked last week. Now, this is not an issue with sample size. This is just something where it's a continuation of what we saw last year. One of the big problems with Rodgers in 2018 was that he would miss a lot of, for lack of a better way of putting it, like layup throws, like short throws where they were into the flat or to an open receiver very quickly after the snap. And that was just not a thing that he did at all for pretty much his entire starting career up until about 2017. Now, last year you could point to the injury, and I don't think that's unfair, but he's healthy now. And especially on the Packers' last possession, or the last real possession, not the kneel down one, where it was coming off the interception from Adrian Amos on second down. The Packers are really just trying to kill the clock, and LaFleur calls an RPO. So Rodgers is probably going to run this unless he just sees a great matchup where he's going to have an easy first down, because that would end the game. And that's exactly what happened. He had Valdez-Scantling moving into the flat with plenty of cushion. So he makes the correct read. We're going to throw it to him, and Rodgers just burns some worms with it. Like it was one of the worst passes that he had all night, and it was really indicative of some of the problems that we saw last year. Now, maybe those are, again, another thing to do with him not playing in the preseason. I don't know. But because we saw those happen so much last year, whether it was directly after that big injury or months later where he clearly was not 100%, but he was closer to being health-wise the player that he had been, we kept seeing him make those mistakes. And I'm wondering if that's just a part of his game now, that he's going to miss on a lot of those easy throws. And yeah, he's going to have those phenomenal plays down the field, but in the aggregate, it's just not the same player that he was during his peak. We'll have to find out over the course of next month. I know I've said that several times, but we don't want to react to such a small sample size. But that, more than anything else, was my biggest concern for the Packers coming out of week one, in terms of the offense.
Right. If he is this like inconsistent player, if, one snap he looks like, the haters guide to Josh Allen, and the next snap he looks like 2011 Rodgers, can you win with that?
You have to,
like the Super Bowl.
You have to call your offense very differently to do so. I mean, I will never say you can't win with a future Hall of Fame quarterback after seeing the corpse of Peyton Manning get dragged to the finish line by the 2015 Denver Broncos. And that's not who Aaron Rodgers is, even if our concerns with him prove to be, real. Like, this is not that kind of player. He's a more capable quarterback than that. However, you need a lot around him, and you need to call your offense very differently to do so. Now, in theory, at least, and we keep having to say in theory because there's so much about this offensive scheme with the Packers that we don't know, but this is an offense that might be able to support a more inconsistent version of Rodgers and that defense if week one is any indication. And I don't think they're going to be that defense over the course of the season, because in the same way that a lot of the Packers' struggles on offense were related to the quality of the Bears' defense, a lot of the Packers' defensive successes have to be attributed to the presence of Mitch Trubisky. But if they're even, let's just say, a solid unit, like somewhere in the top half of the league in DVOA or whatever your preferred metric is, then yeah, the possibility is there. I don't think that necessarily happens in 2019, because even if the offense eventually does click, I just don't think it's going to be over the course of the next month. And that might just be enough that they just don't have enough wins to either get into the playoffs, or they're in a wild card and they're in a disadvantageous situation. But, down the line, if these concerns about Rodgers prove to be true, the defense ends up being legitimate and the offense eventually clicks in terms of efficiency, then yeah, I mean, they have a chance at some point over the next few years, but those are a lot of ifs, and there's a lot of things we still don't know.
Cool. Well, this is a great way to transition to the defense because I was just about to do that. Let's talk about that defense. Of course, you have to adjust for the fact that Trubisky genuinely just didn't look like he had very much going for him on Sunday. But I mean, this is a good looking defense, and it's a defense that I've wanted to praise for years because I thought they've had a bunch of individually talented players that just couldn't cohere together or they didn't have the coordinator for that. I've been a big Mike Pettin fan, again, for years. And finally, I think, you've got that combination of Mike Pettin having a good understanding of what his players can and can't do, having a great scheme, and having a bunch of very talented players, ton of acquisition in the offseason. But it's building on a really remarkable and promising core of defensive players as well, so much so that they got rid of an extremely talented defensive lineman in order to make all of that room. They don't even need, apparently, Rashawn Gary, who were drafted in the first round. What are your feelings on this defense? And you don't just have to talk about the Bears. I mean, your impressions of the defense overall based off of their acquisitions, Mike Pettin's reputation, what the preseason looked like, week one, everything.
Well, looking at Mike Pettin's performance last year, I think a lot of people looked at the way the defense finished, and it was very, very poor, but injuries played a humongous role in that. And if you look at what that defense was after some injuries, admittedly, but before the injuries just completely decimated the secondary in particular, it was a decent unit. But we're not talking about anything special, but Mike Pettin, his first year around, I want to say week 10, maybe week 11, had that unit performing at, I think, the 18th in DVOA, somewhere around there. So again, we're not talking about a special unit, but considering the absence they already had at that point, it was very clear that Pettin knew what he was doing, and then just injuries just completely destroyed that part of the team. This year, with everyone or pretty much everybody healthy, and then all of those improvements and those additions that you mentioned, this unit should be really, really good if it stays healthy. And it's not just that they finally have pass rushers who are able to create pressure outside of stunts or things like that. It's that secondary has really come into its own. Jair Alexander didn't actually get discussed a lot after week one, but he played phenomenally. I mean, there was virtually nothing happening for the Bears offense going his direction. And that really jives with what we saw last year when he was healthy, that he's not necessarily going to be an absolute shutdown corner, but he's going to be really good in coverage, and he has the opportunities to turn the ball over, even if it didn't happen last week. Darnell Savage is not going to play, I think, as well as he did in week one over the course of the season. He is a rookie, but
asking a lot. Then.
Yeah, it is asking a lot, but that closing speed, and I mean, honestly, just his instincts or intelligence to position himself is just so much different than what we've seen from the Packers free safety. And Adrian Amos, I mean, even if you take out that interception in the end zone, was just really solid throughout the game. I mean, the Pettin used him a lot close to the line of scrimmage in blitzes. Him and I want to say either Kenny Clark, I'm pretty sure it was Kenny Clark, combined for a sack or effectively combined for a sack. Like he's all over the field with the way that Pettin uses him, and he's solid or better in all of those functions. And these are just not things that the Packers defense has had honestly any time recently. You have to go back probably to like 2016 or before. So with all of that talent and with Mike Pettin in his second year, the defense really looks like it's going to come around. So even if it's not what it was in week one, and again, I don't think that's a fair expectation, they might be one of the, I don't know, conservatively, the top 12 defenses in the league over the course of the year. And I mean, it's been a long time since the Packers had that.
So you say top 12, which is a very conservative way of framing, I think, optimism for a unit that has let the team down, I think, in years where Rodgers has really kind of taken off. When you say top 12, it kind of implies that, hey, there's some holes they need to fix. You take a look at the roster, where is their biggest weakness? I mean, maybe it's depth, but I mean, from a position group level, is it just like inside linebacker? Because I mean, even like Martinez isn't bad or anything like that. He's like an above average linebacker, but like, where's the weakness?
I mean, inside linebacker is where you have to look. Martinez looked great in week one, and he's really the centerpiece of the defense from a play calling perspective. Like he's not, I wouldn't say one of the top 5 players on that defense, but he's probably one of the 3 most valuable. It's one of those situations. So if they were to lose him, that would obviously be a huge problem for them. I don't know who would be next in line to call in the plays. It might be, for all I know, Adrian Amos, and he just arrived in Green Bay earlier this year. If you look behind them, they just brought in BJ Goodson. That was a trade that they pretty much had to make because of all the injuries at off-ball linebacker. Orton Burks supposedly is going to come back in the not too distant future, but I don't even know what he's going to be able to provide when he comes back. I mean, we haven't seen him play very much at all over the course of his career because of injuries. And even if we assume, and I don't know that we should, that he is a good player when healthy, he's just not going to be healthy at any point this year. He has some kind of a pectoral tear that seems like a big deal for a linebacker. So
fair enough.
So even if he's someone that they use exclusively in coverage, and where maybe that particular injury is less of a factor, I just don't know that he's going to be able to make that much of an impact. And behind him, the only other guy that they have as a full-time off-ball linebacker is Ty Summers, and he can make a lot of tackles and miss just as many. So yeah, that is a huge concern for Green Bay. If Martinez were to go down, I mean, everything that we saw good about the Packers defense in week 1, I mean, that just might go out the window because there's so much that they try to do pre-snap with adjustments. Martinez is a big part of that. And if he's not there, I just don't know who makes them. So yeah, there's definitely a scenario where injuries hit the team. And if they're located at linebacker, it might just be a good night for that unit. But if they say reasonably healthy and or their injuries happen at other places, they do have depth along the defensive line. They do have depth off the edge. I mean, Rashawn Gary played, I want to say 6 snaps during the first week of the season.
6.
That seems like a number that will improve, considering that a lot of the snaps that he probably should have gotten went to Kyler Fackrell. And I mentioned seemingly a million times on my Twitter account and over at Acme Packing Company. He reached 10.5 sacks last year. That was one of the most misleading sack totals I have ever seen in my entire life. I mean, I think he had, I want to say 12 or 13 total quarterback hits and converted nearly all of them into sacks. That's just not sustainable. And I just don't think he's an impact player when it comes to rushing the passer. So that is going to, you think, be Rashawn Gary, and he'll see his snap count increase. But if, as it happens, if something were to happen to one of the Smiths and they were to miss a few games, Rashawn Gary in theory at least should be able to cover them up. In the secondary, they have a ton of corners. Safety's a little thinner, but I think that they do have a little bit of depth there. It's really just that inside linebacker.
Yeah, so Gary had just as many pressures as Kyler Fackrell. Fackrell, of course, had 3 times as many pass rushing snaps. So there's opportunities to be exploited. 2 big questions. 1, who is the best player on the Packers defense? 2, who is Raven Green?
I believe the answer to the first one is Kenny Clark, and he just had
I would have gone.
Yeah, he had another really, really good game. He is someone who opposing offensive lines have trouble blocking even when they throw 2 guys at him. And if you're that kind of player with the ability to rush the passer and especially his ability to stop the run, you're going to be super valuable in any defense, let alone Mike Pettine's. Now, I still have concerns about him, not about him as a player, but more of the Packers' usage of him. Last year, at one point, I think they were playing him on over like 75% of snaps. That is a lot.
Jesus.
For a guy in, I think he's listed at like 315 pounds, but whatever. A guy of that size, that is probably, 15 percentage points too high? And they used him a lot again in week 1. Now, they will...
Yeah, 76% of snaps.
Yeah, exactly. So I think at some point they're going to have to moderate his snaps or risk losing him near the end of the season like they did in 2018. And they do have guys who can do it. I think Tyler Lancaster is not going to be the pass rusher that Kenny Clark is. He's barely a pass rusher as it is, but he is pretty good against the run and someone who, if you're going to give a handful of snaps at that, like that one tackle or that nose tackle to, he can really handle those. So I do think they have options available to them for if and when they want to reduce Kenny Clark's workload. So as for your second question, Raven Green, he was someone that the Packers, and you should know this, given that you are a proud, I guess we can't say alumnus, but a supporter of JMU.
Yeah, big fan of James Madison University, my Dukes.
Exactly. So Raven Green was an undrafted free agent that I think a fair amount of us thought had a chance to make the practice squad as a rookie, but didn't really think that he was going to make the 53. He did. He played a fair amount of snaps. I don't know if they were necessarily great snaps, but considering his pedigree, it wasn't overly surprising. And injuries just, forced him onto the field. There wasn't anything else the Packers could do. He looks like a very different player this year. And I mean that in the literal sense. Like, he's physically bigger. He bulked up so that he could play a lot more of that linebacker role, the one that they were originally going to give to Josh Jones, and it never worked out. So in week 1, he basically was the Packers' other starting inside linebacker. And I think going forward, you're going to see a lot of that too. Now, the Vikings might be different because of how much they run. I don't think they're going to only attempt 10 passes again, but it's very clear that running the football is very important to them. And that's where I think you're going to see a lot more of BJ Goodson. But over the course of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Raven Green sees the most amount of snaps at linebacker after Blake Martinez, because he can perform well in those roles. He's good in coverage. He's big enough to handle some of the run defense, even if it's not a strength of his. And he's also going to see some time as a more traditional safety. So he's going to be a pretty big part of that team going forward if he stays healthy.
Yeah, well, good to see that the rivalry between him and NDSU alum Darius Shepard hasn't torn the locker room.
Well, we don't know that yet, Eric. It's been 1 week, plenty of time.
It's true. Anything can
plenty of time for the rivalry to take root.
So before we get into kind of a big picture look at the game, offense, defense matchups, if you're the Vikings, you've got Stephon Diggs, you've got Dalvin Cook, you've got Adam Thielen. Maybe Kyle Rudolph is a big part of this equation too. How do you attack this defense? What are the matchups you're looking for? What are the schematic weaknesses that the Green Bay Packers you think probably defensively have? What's the approach here?
Well, we just talked about how the Packers are probably going to use their inside linebackers against the Vikings because of how much they're going to run. That's something that I think that the Vikings can exploit in the passing game. BJ Goodson is, from at least the accounts of the coaches, is going to play a lot this week. And if you're able to get him matched up in coverage against almost literally anybody, that's going to be an advantage. And, that could be Kyle Rudolph. It could be Thielen in the slot. There's plenty of ways that they can do this, but trying to create coverage matches with BJ Goodson, I would imagine, is a big part, or should be at least a big part of their game plan. But also, I think being able to run that play action off the outside zone, that's a big part of a lot of these schemes that we were talking about around the NFL. Gary Kubiak, now Minnesota, a part of that too. And I mean, it's not that it's specifically good against the Packers. I think that's good against pretty much everybody. So until a defense shows that it can stop that and it's not going to fall for those fakes, that should be a big part of their passing game.
All right. Well, let's figure out. I think the Packers are favored by 3. They opened favored by 2.5. Kind of a big move to go from 2.5 to 3. Takes a little bit more money to swing things that way. And the over/under is like 46 or something like that. Who do you think wins? What's your prediction for the game? Give us a final score. We're not going to hold you accountable. We never do.
I always refuse to give a final score. That's just I just don't know what anyone guessing a score is really going to do, because it almost never plays out. I do, however, think that
in the history of this show, one person has gotten it right once. So,
I will not be number 2, unfortunately. But I think that the Packers win. Being at home is going to be a big part of that, obviously. And I just think that offense cannot look as bad as it did in week 1. Perhaps that's the part of this that I'll end up having to eat later, because if they run the offense like they did in week 1, I don't think they're going to be that much more effective. But just because of the scheme that LaFleur wants to run, the value of play action, and the fact they have a lot of smart people working on that offense, I just think that's going to improve. And as we saw, over the course of his career, Rodgers off play action is very effective. Their one big play in week 1 was that 47-yarder off the play action Yankee route concept. I just think that's going to have to be a bigger part of that offense. And even if that's the only thing that really changes, that might be enough to give them, along with Lambeau Field, the win.
All right. Well, thanks so much for agreeing to do this interview, giving us insight into the much hated Packers. I suppose I was supposed to give you kind of more crap over the course of this interview. Oh, well, next time.
You're so blinded by the JMU pride that you really couldn't focus on anything else.
I'm really glad you anticipated what I meant when I asked who Raven Green was. That's fantastic.
The brand is strong. Let's just say that.
The brand is strong. All right, cool. Is there anything you want to plug? So your Twitter's at @by_JBH. Is that right?
@by_JBH on Twitter. You can find my work at SB Nation, NFL.com. And starting the season, I'm actually covering the Los Angeles Chargers for Sports Illustrated. So obviously all things,
congrats.
All things that Vikings fans really care about. So please, please at least give it a shot. I would appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Let's go to the mailbag. And the first question that we have is actually a little bit of Vikings news that we did not discuss at the top of the show because it was going to be the first thing that we were going to discuss at the top of the mailbag. So the first question is from Nathan, who asks, with Doctson going on IR, do you think the Vikings will utilize Irv Smith more as a receiver than a blocker? Which is also to say that Doctson is going on IR for the first few games of the year.
Right, yeah. I think the league requirement is 7 games. I'm not sure, but he has to be, you can't just put players on IR and then take them back willy-nilly. It's meant to be a process that like saves the team cap and roster space, so you can't just abuse it. So, he was limited in practice last week. The reason he wasn't active for the game, from my understanding, didn't have to do with injury. It had to do with the fact that he had arrived with the team like a couple days before. And so he had practiced actually on Wednesday, and then today he was on IR. So an injury must have been re-aggravated, or the injury that he was working through, they took a second look at it, and they decided, this isn't, worth attempting to practice through consistently. So, he's put on injured reserve. Ian Rappaport reports that he might return. He's a candidate to return later in the season. We'll see. So the knock-on effects of that, first, kind of none, right? Because the Vikings were without him last week, and they, when they announced the 53-man roster, they only had 4 receivers, and so what comes next, and whether or not Irv Smith is used as a receiver or as a blocker, that's dictated by whether or not they want to throw or pass. I don't think they're going to put Irv Smith in or out of the lineup entirely dependent on what the situation is. Now, if David Morgan was off the PUP list and on the roster, I think that they would be a little bit more, they'd be more willing to platoon and say, hey, we're going to run the ball in the situation maybe, 70% of the time. So David Morgan's going to be in there. We're going to throw the ball, 70% of the time. In this situation, so Irv Smith's going to be in there. And so really it's just going to be, and, maybe they go 2 tight end sets more often, but they did that a lot last week anyway. So if the plan initially was to go into 11 personnel a lot because they have Josh Doctson, and now they go into 22 a lot, does that mean they run the ball more? I don't think so. I think they still want to pass and run about as much, just with slightly different personnel on the field. So with that said, what does Irv Smith do? He could still be in pass protection, right? Because the Vikings have used tight ends in pass protection a lot. And I've been pretty critical of it. I think that that's a really poor idea. I'd rather have your running back stay in and your tight end leak out. That tends to just produce better plays in my experience. But that's something that they do. But I wouldn't say that they're just going to have Irv Smith replace the potential role that Doctson was going to play and just treat him like another receiver on a couple of snaps. So yeah, it's just, are they going to run the ball or throw the ball in that play? And then Smith is just going to be on the field when he's on the field. I don't think it changes that much.
I like to think that it has more to do with the fact that Washington's med staff is completely inept and didn't notice that Doctson actually had an injury until he went to Minnesota. You're bleeding from there, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Whoa, hey, you got to get that checked out. Well, we got somebody for that. So
as it turns out, we don't just rub your injury on the field.
Yeah.
Rub some dirt into it. You can wrap that up over here. We even have ice. It's amazing. Which kind of goes with the question from Tanner. Any insight on why Doctson was placed on IR? The team is being a little bit quiet about it. As to exactly why, as you had mentioned. So I still like the idea that Washington didn't even know that he was hurt. He's not really catching balls, so why do we care?
Right, yeah.
Luke Braun asks, is Hercules the Mataafa the primary pass rushing defensive tackle now? Steffen's obviously the run stuffer, but is Herc the guy on third down?
It seems like it. They made Jalen Holmes inactive, but I wouldn't be surprised if they decided what to do between Jalen and Herc game by game. And so they'll have Jalen Holmes active if they need a guy that's going to be just kind of an all-around defensive tackle. and then they'll have Herc if they feel really comfortable on first down with Shamar Stephen being primarily a run stuffer and Herc just being down there on third down. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's what they ended up doing. Kind of funny because Jalen Holmes is a former defensive end. And so for him to be, the all-around defensive tackle and the former defensive tackle to be just the pass rushing guy, it's just kind of interesting, but that happens. So I wouldn't be surprised if that ended up being a platoon. Remember, Jalen played ahead of Herc throughout almost all of the preseason and definitely throughout training camp. But Herc was in more often with the first team on first team snaps when the Vikings were a nickel in preseason. So that's really just a question of kind of who can you have on the active roster and what does the game plan dictate? If it's a very heavy running team that, like say it's Seattle, right? It's the perfect example. They're the only team in the NFL that ran the ball more than passed last year. That game is on December 2nd. I wouldn't be surprised if, say everybody's healthy, if Jalen Holmes is active instead of Hercules Mataafa. If they feel like, the situation is difficult to predict and they'd rather just have an all around guy, I could see Holmes, but primarily because it is a passing league, I would say that you're more likely going forward to see, given that everybody's healthy, Hercules active because there's a specific role he can play on the field. And that's, like you said, a primary pass rushing guy.
Yeah. Kenneth Allen has a question that says, given that the Packers defense is officially spooky, are you more worried about their run defense, especially with the emphasis on the run now for the Vikings, or their pass defense?
If their run defense was all world and their pass defense is above average, I'd still say pass defense. So, and it's not all world. It was pretty good against the Bears. And they've got Kenny Clark, who's great. The pass defense. Jair Alexander was my favorite corner in that draft. I have some reason to believe, which is not the same thing as saying I have a source that says. So that's not what I'm saying. I have some reason to believe that the Vikings would have picked Jair Alexander above my Qs if Alexander had fallen all the way down to 20 or whatever it was. Were the Vikings at 24? I don't know. But yeah, they really like Jair Alexander, and it turns out that maybe that was correct because he's been really excellent. Kevin King, there's been some kind of uncertainty about how good he would be because of the return from injury. We cover a lot of this in the interview. We didn't talk about it too much just in the context of this question. But I would say that even though their best player is kind of a run defense maven, I am still just more worried about what the passing situation creates. Because if you can't run the ball, you can just pass. But if you can't pass the ball and you get behind, then you can't win. So that's the concern there. It's a pretty decent pass defense from what we've seen.
Zen Cubit asks, who is the most for the lulz guy to replace Doctson with, and why?
It's probably like Corey Coleman, right? Like you can't...
I was going to say Treadwell. Just like, okay, fine. Like, we get it. Just you were dropped for a while. You just come back on for a game or so. Let's see what you got.
Charles Johnson, that'd be good.
Ooh. Is there a former Packer that is quasi available?
I mean, technically, Charles Johnson's a former Packer, but a more recent former Packer. Yeah, more recent former. Oh my God. What's his name? Jeff Janis. Oh, there you go. That'd be perfect.
Let's just throw him out there for that. That'll be fine. Bubka asks, has Rodgers lost a significant amount of arm strength, and should we expect his accuracy issue from last week to carry on? Vikings fans have been looking for like any ray of hope as far as the potential decline of Aaron Rodgers for years now, especially because his supporting cast behind him for backup quarterback has been so terrible.
Yeah. Well, like Jason said, there's not a ton of evidence to say that he's good right now. There's a lot of reasons to believe, which I guess you could characterize as evidence, but nothing like solid, right? That you'd say, hey, this is
Well, that turns
This
into
is
the
why
argument of faith over like science or faith over stats sort of thing. Like,
well, I mean, the reason to believe is not just faith. It's we have a history of not to say anything about religion, but we have a history of Rodgers being a phenomenal quarterback that we can
damn
point
it,
to.
I nearly got you into it.
Almost got me. That you can tangentially or tangibly say, hey, he's been good. Quarterbacks that are the best quarterback in the world for like 7 straight years, they'll find it. They'll get it back, right? Tom Brady did the same thing. He was dropping off in 2013. It was actually pretty abysmal, although they still, made a Super Bowl or two. And then he comes back and he puts up just these remarkable numbers. So, elite quarterbacks tend to last a long time. Rodgers has a little bit less wear and tear in terms of total snaps played than elite quarterbacks. He's obviously, taken some worse injuries. But, he hasn't played well recently for the past 2.5, 3 years. So that's part of it. But I don't think his arm strength has diminished at all. I know that there was a pass on that Thursday night game where he throws it deep and he rainbows it. And people are like, oh, this deep throw, normally he would just laser it. He's rainbowing it. What's happening? Well, if he was throwing completely on platform, I would say, yeah. But, he's throwing off platform. His body is falling away from the ball. His feet are really weirdly positioned and the release is so short. All of these things are working against him, but he still gets the ball kind of perfectly to the right spot deep down the field. So I wouldn't say there's any evidence that his arm strength is diminishing. But I would say, his accuracy or his communication is a problem. And we talked a little bit about that in the interview.
I mean, if you were going to look at whether or not a QB was declining based on their first week or second week performance, you'd be looking at Cam Newton. You wouldn't end up looking at Aaron Rodgers on that. So
the rules say it can only be one QB. So
it can only be one of them. And which apparently means Joe Flacco is safe this year. I would not,
again.
I would not have bet that. I would have thought that this would have been the year that Flacco goes down, but I guess I'm wrong. Eddie the Dog asks, if the Vikings need to put Chris Boyd on the field, is there anything the Vikings can do scheme-wise to protect him from being entirely exposed by Rodgers?
Well, I'm really only concerned about Devontae Adams. Now, Jason makes some good points about how Marquez Valdes-Scantling is somebody that I should probably be a little bit more concerned about than I am. And he's this remarkable speed demon, but I'm just going to stick Trey Waynes on him the whole time if I'm the Vikings and just kind of let that matchup be that matchup. So if Rhodes goes down, Boyd plays, and maybe, Waynes goes down and Boyd plays, and then you kind of, and maybe that's a concern. But right now, Boyd is, say, playing for Xavier Rhodes. I would just keep Harrison Smith capped on top and just follow him. I'd be so comfortable doubling him all game because I'm not that concerned about Aaron Jones or Jimmy Graham, which is a weird thing to say, or like I said, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Now, if Waynes goes down, maybe it's actually smarter to put Mark Fields out there just because he's a faster cornerback. But I would just always kind of cap a safety on top of him to limit kind of what Adams can do.
I was reading an interesting stat this today on Twitter that was explaining how Aaron Rodgers, the top 3 targets for Aaron Rodgers over the last year
Nick
and a
Olson
half
tweeted
so.
This out. This is great.
Yeah, the top 3 were Adams, the sideline for a sideline for an incompletion, and then Jimmy Graham. Those are your top 3, and it's between second and third, there's a big drop off. Watching Aaron Rodgers over the years, you do notice that he tends to throw outside instead of trying to force something in there for a potential pick. So
and I wish I had gotten into this part of the conversation. The interview was lasting a little long about risk aversion because you talk to some of the people I really respect on football Twitter, people like Charles McDonald and Begrudgingly Justice. And they think it's absurd that we talk about Aaron Rodgers' low interception rate as a signal that he doesn't that he's not playing efficient football because he's not willing to take chances. And they intentionally mischaracterize the argument as interceptions are good, huh? And it's like, obviously interceptions are bad. No one's saying that. We're saying that if you're always throwing the ball away instead of taking a chance at a ball that could potentially be intercepted, then you're making bad decisions. And you're not letting them move the ball down the field because in a small percentage of cases, and there's this really good article by Timo Risk at PFF_Moo on Pro Football Focus. I don't know if it's behind the paywall or not. I assume it is because I think the articles he writes tend to be. But this is a really good article about how he should just be more accepting of risk because he's shown in the past that in those tight windows, and maybe this is another sign of his decline, but he's always thrown the ball away a lot. In those tight windows, in those difficult situations, he tends to be accurate and he doesn't tend to produce a lot of turnovers anyway. And league-wide, your chances of a turnover in that scenario are anywhere between like twice as much to 3 times as much, which honestly is like not that much considering that the thing we're talking about is the risk of throwing a turnover. And for Rodgers, obviously, if you just kind of doubled or tripled his, and maybe that's not fair, but if you doubled or tripled his, I mean, that wouldn't be a problem. That'd still be one of the best interception rates in the league. But if you're not willing to take like 4 plays of those risks where 2 of them go for 40 yards, 1 of them is intercepted, and 1 of them falls incomplete, then you're hurting yourself because 80 yards is worth more than 1 interception. So, he throws the ball away a lot, and it hurts them.
I mean, obviously he's a coward. I mean, that's the biggest takeaway you could possibly get from that discussion is just that Aaron Rodgers is clearly a coward. Oh,
by the way, heartbreaking news: Adam Thielen and Aaron Rodgers are pretty good friends.
I did see that they've been golfing together. I don't. I feel bad for Adam Thielen's family if that's the case.
Well, I was about to say, this is the closest thing Rodgers has to family, so difficult to take. I don't super love making fun of Rodgers because I'm just like, what if they suck? What if the family sucks? To let him not have a family. But that joke was just sitting there, so I had to take it.
It really was. Like the fruitcake that was given to you by the member of the family that was just invited just because your mom made a big deal about making sure they felt included despite the fact that you haven't really talked to them in 7 years. I'm not speaking of personal experience at all here. Let's go to the next question. Kyle Slaby asks...
Sounds like Rodgers was right.
Kyle Slaby asks, is Rodgers still a major threat when he breaks the pocket, or have the injuries impacted his throwing success, whether mentally from fear of further injury or physically from old age? Is it better to aggressively rush or take the rope-a-dope strategy?
No, I think he's still a threat when he's turning and running. Because the thing is, his bad passes occur in like any situation kind of devoid of context, and his good passes also occur in any situation. I wouldn't say necessarily devoid of context because they tend to occur like later in games when they matter more, which is kind of frustrating. But yeah, and so if he's ever been a threat rolling outside the pocket and throwing deep, which spoiler, he is, or he was, then he will continue to be that kind of threat. And I actually would be more worried about an inconsistent quarterback being off schedule than an inconsistent quarterback being on schedule, because you can at least anticipate and break on the ball and stuff like that. And it just feels like the Vikings are just not as good on scramble drills. And maybe that's like just trauma I've learned from like their games against like the Seahawks and stuff. And generally the running quarterback problem the Vikings have historically had.
Historically is right. That seems to be like we cannot stop running quarterbacks. It's there was a discussion on another podcast involving Sage Rosenfels.
To name? Okay.
I can't remember. Sage Rosenfels was on it earlier this week, and he had talked about how the Super Bowl in 2009 against the Vikings, if the Vikings were going to make it, that team was built for it because Peyton Manning didn't scramble. Yeah. Peyton Manning didn't run. And so you look, okay, yeah, that would make sense. And then you think of the success that running quarterbacks have had against the Vikings over the years. Like, how have we not done anything about this?
The thing is, like, I don't know if that continues to be the case despite the Josh Allen game. Which, by the way, this problem keeps getting renewed. The thing that we can hang our hat on is that the Vikings, who are 1-0 on Tuesday night games, demolished Michael Vick at, I would argue, his peak, right? So They've got that, but also they have Michael Vick's like 2 best highlights. So, who knows, right?
And in case you missed it on Sunday, they really wanted to show you every single angle of that highlight.
Yeah, that was cool.
I really enjoyed his.
I was just waiting for them to just like turn the knife and be like, by the way, here's some Steve Young highlights. Apropos of nothing. You're like, oh,
my favorite part
man.
of that discussion was that Michael Vick does not remember that, which is what he said flat out. It's like, do you remember that player? What was going through your head? It's like, no. But I've watched it enough times where I can figure that I was really happy about winning and I was heading toward the locker room because I was relieved it was over. It was like, that man, that is a man who will openly admit to the number of concussions that he suffered.
Right. But yeah, so maybe this version of the Vikings are worse against quarterbacks who break the pocket than inside the pocket. But that is just so difficult for me to figure out if that's the case, or if I'm just like, remember when Russell Wilson like demonized both Captain Munnerlyn and Josh Robinson on the same play, despite the fact that they were both 50 yards apart from each other? That was cool. I remember that. But maybe they're good against the scramble drill. I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, well, we get to find out when Aaron Rodgers decides to scramble for 80 against us. Ian Pauly asks an interesting question, and that question is, what is a potential mismatch to watch for this week that favors the Vikings, and what about the other way around?
So on the first half of that question, I'll say one interesting piece of news that broke after Jason and I recorded was that David Bakhtiari wasn't practicing, which means obviously he's a candidate potentially to not play in this game. And so Everson is right. He's a top 3 left tackle in the league. Madden had him number 1 last year. PFF had him number 1 last year. He might have been at the top of amongst the tackles in the NFL 100. So whoever you ask, top tackle, maybe top 3 tackle. He and Everson have always had very kind of interesting battles. The way that they've played each other has been kind of, I think, different than the way Bakhtiari plays other edge rushers, and Everson plays him a little bit different than he plays Bakhtiari. And I think Everson saying that he's really good at holding is maybe an indication of the fact that they kind of recognize each other's styles. So that would have been kind of fascinating, but the Packers don't really have depth at tackle, and they certainly don't have great guards. We talked about that. So Everson versus like whoever, right? That's a pretty good matchup. I'll take that. Everson looked like a Pro Bowler last week. Michael Zimmer said that, right? Mike Zimmer said that. So that's one to watch. If we don't count that, I would say Dalvin Cook against Blake Martinez in coverage. Martinez is fine, right? But I mean, you heard Jason in the recording. The inside linebacker group is just not one that is going to strike fear in a lot of people. And it's really just about, what does that secondary do? What's that defensive line going to do? So I would say that that's kind of the secondary matchup to look for. The other way around is interesting because I don't know that, there's a weakness on the Vikings that they could target on defense. And then offensively, like it's obvious, right? It's Kenny Clark and Preston Smith and Zadarius Smith against like that offensive line, which I don't think anyone's confident in even after that game. So, it's that group of people against the other group of people. Like it's all 5 of them. Like that's a problem. Like, I'm concerned about Dean Lowry, and then there's like 4 other people better than him. So that's where I'd go to favor the Packers.
Caleb asks, do you think Elflein will be benched at some point this season?
Maybe. This team kind of seems loath to move quickly on these questions, except when it happened to Alex Boone, I guess. But they don't seem to want to do that. They have done it in the past. Mike Harris, I think, is a really good example. Before he suffered the head injury, bleeding in the brain or something like that. That forced him to retire. When they moved him from tackle to guard to cover for injury, he just played really well. So they're like, oh, well, okay, well, he's a guard. Great, fantastic. Let's do that. And then Joe Berger eventually replaced, Sullivan, and then eventually replaced Fusco. But I think those were decisions that were generally made in the offseason. But so they're slow to do it, but like the candidates on the roster to replace him are already there in Dakota Dozier and apparently maybe, and not definitely, but maybe Brett Jones. And the Vikings have already kind of openly recognized that Elflein has been struggling. I mean, they drafted a center, right? They moved him to guard to kind of hope that something would happen. So I could see it. I think that is possible. I'm just like not optimistic because of their history at being kind of slow to resolve these.
So Matt asks an interesting question on Twitter. He asks, is the Kirk Cousins Pizza Ranch deal and commercial the most cringeworthy Vikings endorsement that you have witnessed?
It's good that you said Vikings endorsement because I think the Kirk Cousins series of advertisements for like those fireplaces. Have you seen these, James?
I don't believe I have seen the fireplace ones, no.
Okay, we're stopping the show. You got to watch it. We'll come back after you watch it. I'm serious.
All right, you talk, I will watch.
So those are like awkward. I don't know if...
Oh, God, I have seen these.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Those are worse. I don't know if so that's the reason why I'm just like, those Pizza Ranch commercials are not like the bottom of the barrel when it comes to Cousins. Like him jumping into a fake President Donald Trump's arms because of a nuke. I actually don't remember what happens at the end. But that's like the worst. And it's not because it's like Trump or whatever. Like the acting is just awful. And the premise is also awful, honestly. But Diggs sometimes for those Xfinity, like, so his Geico commercials, great. His Xfinity commercials are like pretty awkward, honestly. I think they're kind of cringeworthy. And then like any local car commercial starring, a Viking, I would say is probably worse. Like the Pizza Ranch commercials are just like, this is weird and awkward and you don't have camera presence. But like all of the car commercial ones, they're just like mailing it in. So they're more cringeworthy.
Yeah, when I think of cringeworthy endorsements or cringeworthy things, I tend to think of like Tony Siragusa and the man diapers commercials that came out while he was still being like featured on a lot of Vikings broadcasts on Fox. Not that he ever played for Minnesota, just that he was on a lot of Fox on NFL Sunday afternoon broadcasts for the Vikings.
Well, Jimmy Johnson doing the Extends commercials is that's something.
Yeah, then you end up just envisioning him in a tub somewhere, and it all goes downhill. There's some rant by a stand-up comedian about why is it every time you take one of these like male enhancement pills, all of a sudden you end up outside in a tub somewhere? Like, is this required, or is this is this just your life now? Is this required, like from your pharmacist? Like,
this is what you do now.
This isn't just something that you do once. This is something you do always. So let's talk about Don from Ohio's question, the final question of the show. Don says, "Dear Arif, your cohort on this podcast is getting married in next month and asks you to cater it. He's supplying the meat, but you must make the rest of the menu. What seasonings do you use to cook human flesh, and what side dishes do you What side dishes do you recommend to go with it?"
Wow.
I told Don, I said, this is your best question in at least months or possibly years.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't see this question in the mailbag because it's on the second page and I didn't scroll down. So excellent job. This took me completely by surprise. First thought I have is if I'm asked to cater your wedding, I'm watching Hannibal. Because that might give me ideas. And then I'm watching that Binging with Babish episode where he does one of the recipes from Hannibal.
Oh,
he doesn't cook
the
a
clay.
human.
Yeah. The clay thigh cooking. Yeah.
Right. He doesn't actually cook a human, but he mentions it. So, actually, first thing I do is I call the police. But if that's out of the question, I should clarify. If that's out of the question, then I'm doing my research with incognito mode. My VPN is on. I don't want anyone to like oh, what's going on here?
It's the Letter Kenny scene when they go on the dark web for the first time, and the first thing they pull up is recipes on how to cook human. That's all it is. Or it turns into the Simpsons thing where you get the book off the shelf that's how to cook. And then you blow on it, humans, and then you blow on it some more, and it's 4, yes. And then it's 40.
Yes.
It's from the special part.
Yeah.
It's the special part of the library for that one. Oh, God.
My guess is that humans are probably stringy. They probably don't have a ton of intramuscular fat. They work all the time. They move all the time. So it's probably a braise. You want to like break down the connective tissue if you're in that situation.
For those that are lost on this particular topic and are new to the show,
no, we're done. Yeah, that's good. Is that it? Okay. No, sorry. Yeah,
we won't lean on you anymore for your tips and tricks on cooking human. For those new to this conversation, last summer, or rather last fall, my stepson woke up out of a dead sleep, shouting something along the lines of, "No, I don't eat people anymore," or something like that. To which we just referred to him as the cannibal for a really long time, and he just sort of accepted that as his nickname and moved on.
Wait, hold on. Did you ever explain the genesis of the nickname, or he was just like, "Yeah, okay, that makes sense"?
Oh, no. We explained why, because that night I asked him, "What the hell were you like? Were you dreaming about something?" Like, I was like, "No, I don't remember doing anything." Which he's 13, so automatically he's a liar. But I just assumed that he was dreaming about eating people or something. So, and I made the mistake. I had to tell it on the show because it was so goddamn funny that it's become a running joke for Dawn now. So that if we're cooking human, at least one person at the reception will be happy. So. I appreciate Don for looking out for my stepson. I appreciate that, and I know he does too. Arif, what do you have to plug?
A new recipe book, apparently. Sorry, just cooking 40 human. I just died.
We haven't had
such a well-paced, executed Simpsons joke too.
It really was, and we haven't had a good old school Simpsons reference on at least 3 weeks. So here we are.
But yeah, I've got a piece coming up in The Athletic that'll be published by the time a lot of people are listening to this about kind of a preview for the Packers. I'll be stealing a bunch of stuff from Jason and putting it into the Athletic, so that'll be good for me. And then I'm also doing kind of a live Q&A on Friday. And then I did a breakdown, but I plugged that last episode. So, head over to The Athletic. Oh, also, cool. I'm supposed to point out, I might be boothcasting on Monday night. So if people are unfamiliar, Boothcast is an app that allows you to replace the live commentary you get in games with commentary from like your favorite commentators and also me. Where you turn down the TV, you turn up the app after you select your boothcaster, and we'll be providing live commentary. I'll be working with Seth Galina, who's an offensive wizard. He's an offensive coordinator in Canadian football, but the skills translate for a local high school. And he's a big Saints fan, but he doesn't boothcast Saints games, and so he's got a really good understanding of kind of the rest of the league. So I'll be doing that. Download the app; it's called Boothcast. Follow us on Twitter @Boothcast, and hopefully it's something that you'll enjoy.
You and I would have had a blast during this last game, during the Bucks Carolina game. There would have been a lot of
kidding.
I forget what the policy is on cursing, but it would have been.
Oh, it's allowed.
Oh, well, then it really would have been enjoyable. I didn't even have any money on the game. It was just dumb as hell. It just involved me ranting even more than I did at the beginning of the show. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will be back next week with a recap of the Green Bay game. So we look forward to seeing you then. For Arif, for Dusty, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.